afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest iteration of the sessions on territory this spring. We are addressing repair and urbanism in a broken world. I would like to thank to my co-curators in the program, Nazli Tumerdam, Marija Marić with us, and also Kiana Zhu behind the camera and Jakov Walter in the online broadcast. I look forward to hear if we have, how many people we have in our digital auditorium today. Special welcome goes to our speaker this afternoon, Ann Miljački, who will talk about modes of repair in architectural pedagogies, followed by a discussion with Freek Persyn, Grégoire, Farquet, and interesting group in our student body unmasking space. All of them will be introduced in a moment. I would like to say for maybe some of you who have not seen or heard about this program before, Sessions on Territory is a format that started about 7 years ago with the focus on the urban and the future on the of the urban, understood in an extended sense. Over the years, we debated an urban beyond the city in an effort to capture the territory and the processes of planetary urbanization. We also discussed urban beyond the human. Urban beyond the human, as I mentioned, urban beyond the object, in an effort to shift the debate and contours of architectural education and practice. Each iteration of the sessions tackled the different perspective, urgent perspective, from neoliberal power and politics to Anthropocene ecologies, to technologies beyond techno-fixing, politics of material flows and accumulations, and so on. And in this iteration, this spring, we are rethinking architecture and urbanism through the politics and practices of repair. The idea is that it is a high time for a change. Cities and urbanizations are being recast, we believe, in our day and age, from being seen as drivers of progress in the past century, also to presently the source of planetary hazard. The critical examination of anthropocentric worldviews, the greening of politics, economics, growing social movements, climate activism, all are reflected in urban space and contributing to exploration of alternatives. And in this pivoting moment, we believe we are facing a paradigm shift which involves new narratives, new politics, and new practices of repair, aiming to reduce exploitation, to care for what already exists, to repair what has been damaged, and to conserve resources. In a word, repair, we believe, is at the core of a changing mindset within architectural teaching and practice, and we are dedicating this program this spring to exploring this notion. We are also aligned this spring with the project, The Great Repair, Politics of a Repair Society, a collaboration between ARC+, the Academy of the Arts in Berlin, University of Luxembourg, and our team at ETH. And this issue, which was launched here 2 weeks ago, is a departure point, a kind of a conceptual base that we assembled for exploring these themes. The goal of the project is the exhibition in Berlin at the Academy of the Arts that opens in mid-October. And starting from this reader, which I recommend to everybody, we are dedicating the series this spring with collaborators and exhibitors and contributors to the project, exploring some of the core questions in addressing the notion of repair in relation to architecture. So what is a repair ethos? How are we turning it into praxis? What does it mean in relation to the material culture in a broader sense? Are we or can we position repair as a paradigmatic orientation in our field as being alternative, for example, to, and in particular to the growth-based and techno-fix approaches? Are we seeing a kind of a paradigm emerging? And then also in relation to today's session, how do we conceive of self-repair of our discipline? How are we repairing, for instance, the construction industry, the architectural office, and its productivist logics, and indeed, how are we repairing architectural education and the curriculum? And on this last note of architectural education, it is a huge pleasure to welcome Anna Miljački, a fascinating individual, fascinating architect, critic, curator, and professor of architecture at MIT, where she teaches history, theory, and design. She's also leading architecture and urbanism group at MIT, directed a Master in Architecture program there, and previously taught studios and seminars at Columbia University, City College in New York, and Harvard GSD. She has recently edited a log issue on co-authoring with Ann Lui, and also another interesting volume, Journal of Architectural Education, Pedagogies for a Broken World, with Igor Marjanović and Cephas. So these texts that have been shared with you are also crucial for the discussion tonight. Anna's talk presents or will present, and I'm in fact really excited to say that first time in this 8 years of this program, we are actually concretely addressing pedagogy, and I think this is fantastic. Anna's talk will present examples of pedagogical and curatorial work produced within the framework of her fascinating pedagogical project, the Critical Broadcasting Lab, that she has been directing since 2018. And has spawned a series of fantastic experiments. So these include the Collective Architecture Studio series that we will be hearing about, I believe, aimed at reconfiguring the way that architectural authorship flows, is understood, and is addressed in the context of academia, while simultaneously also considering ways that collective ownership has historically shaped and might yet shape architectural outcomes. So all that followed by a debate with our guests and with our curators, Marija and Nazli. So looking forward for a great event, and welcome, Anna.
I turn myself on now. All right. Thank you, Milice, for introducing me, for setting up the framework. And hello, everyone. I am super grateful and very excited to be here. And I want to thank again Milice Topalović and Marija Marić, as well as the ArchPlus team, for inviting me to this cross-institutional conversation about repair. I want to thank Nazli to Miriam for coordinating it all, and Evelyn Gordon for taking care of me, and of course, all of you for actually coming out in person to play. It's a lot better that way, but you know, I'm also grateful for whoever is somewhere else in the ether, maybe listening to this. So, in many ways, my editorial work, my pedagogical work, and my labs work, insofar as MIT would recognize Critical Broadcasting Lab as a lab, is all dedicated to the project and the ethos of repair, as well as to collectives. I see these two terms as contingent on one another, and it's possible, or I'll admit, that my early life in the Yugoslavian socialism and contending with its ruins ever since, as well as my historical scholarship dedicated to architects working in Czechoslovakia and on the Second World more broadly, make this coupling, collective and repair, an inevitable political project for me. So before I dive more deeply into a few concrete pedagogical examples, I wanted to introduce two recent journals I worked on, both of which I hope will resonate with what comes next, as they represent, in a way, the culmination, in print at least, of concerns that track through different media in my work. So this recent issue of Log, which you had the intro for if you wanted to look at it, I co-edited with my sister-in-arms, Ann Lui, and it's dedicated to the twin topics of authoring and co-authoring. And I won't rehearse the whole issue for you, but I wanted to briefly relay our key hopes for it. And clearly this is, about this question of authorship in general in the field, in the discipline. But so we believed, or believing, that there is a generation of new work out there now, or maybe summoning it and willing it to exist for this journal, that self-consciously sidesteps codified cultural narratives of authorship. We offered in this project a sketch of a theory of co-authoring, polemic perhaps, a kind of carrier bag theory, the way sci-fi writer Ursula Le Guin liked to think of it. And we were hoping to expand the concept and the practice of authorship to include, in architecture, to include many forms of agency. And in this we were helped by various proponents of situated knowledge who only ever see tabula as plena. They helped us think about the ways that co-authorship moves, the way that it links like and unlike things. There's an update that it's telling me to install. And imagine what kinds of epistemologies co-authoring might require. So we knew that for trekking through the wet sand of co-authorship, which is the way Lauren Berlon talks about it, we would be best served, as Donna Haraway says, with partial, locatable, critical knowledges sustaining the webs of connections called solidarity in politics, and shared conversations in epistemology. We also believe that this situated thinking is capacious enough to include non-human entities, temporalities, and intelligences. And if you know log, it's not, I only have two images of it. It's not, images are not its focus, but every log has a final drawing or kind of that closes the issue. And for us, in that place, we put this pattern for a carrier bag done by a student at Rice. The carrier bag, just to demystify it, is any bag that carries things. So your tote bag is a carrier bag, but you can picture a kind of bag full of stuff. So we imagined our issue of log itself as the contents of a kind of carrier bag for a carrier bag theory of co-authorship, in which we included frameworks that we believed continue to operate on what is possible when it comes to this notion and question, legal, cultural, and professional frameworks. But we also added to them passionate construction, silicone sealant, and the critters who want to traverse it, webbed connections, unfinished objects as both objects and agents in the processes of making, rules and regulations, hopes for organizing, a disciplinary commons, contestations of regulations, useless products, traces and scars of violent histories, new ways of valuing work, anonymous signatures, developers, financial interests, political allegiances, solidarity, both willed and non-consensual, metaphors, and technologies that enable communication. And then we also included ourselves and all of our readers, a very colorful we, into our bag, because we thought that we also appropriately designates all of our carrier bag's contents and the friction, tact, and tenderness necessary for enabling exchanges of transformative co-authored. And I want to leave you, obviously, if you've read this or if you know Ursula Le Guin, you realize that we are drawing a lot from her for this particular concept. When she wrote about the carrier bag,
All right. So, to get back to Ursula Le Guin, I want to leave you with the paragraph in which she actually describes her own carrier bag for the writing of science fiction. And we can certainly talk about this when we talk, but I just like it's a beautiful image. So she says that she has a great heavy sack full of wimps and klutzes and tiny grains of things smaller than a mustard seed, and intricately woven nets, which when laboriously unknotted are seen to contain one blue pebble, and imperturbably functioning chronometer telling time on another world, and a mouse's skull full of beginnings without ends, of initiations, of losses, of transformations and translation, and far more tricks than conflicts, far fewer triumphs than snares and delusions, full of spaceships that get stuck, missions that fail, and people who don't understand. The second journal that Milica also mentioned, also hotish off the press, which may have found its way to you if ETH is part of the ACSA network, is this JAE, Journal of Architectural Education, titled Pedagogies for a Broken World. And in this editorial project, my co-editors, Cephas, Igor, Marjanović, and I were similarly thinking about the subjects who speak, or more precisely about the subjects who have rarely spoken under the disciplinary spotlight, but may hold the key to transformative thinking and pedagogies that could help us reorient the whole discipline, its politics, its authorities, its intelligences and goals. And I realize that this sounds like a very, very ambitious goal. And in the long run, I think that's the goal we all should have, but the ambition of the journal was at least to scratch the surface of some of these questions. So in both projects, JAE and LOG, the term world in the singular signifies many worlds. For JAE, we explicitly rejected the one world extractivism that renders null many worlds by condensing them into the singular, and we instead followed indigenous studies scholars Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blazer, who offered the pluriverse as an important analytic to navigate the tension between, the way they say it, the scholarly and political recognition of the ecological crisis that threatens to eradicate life on the planet, and the obstinate demands for existence presented by worlds whose disappearance was assumed from the outset of the Anthropocene. So the world, in the title of our issue of JAE, includes the planetary, as it refers to the intersections between the many worlds of the pluriverse. This world of worlds, then, is an expression of our hope that despite the extraction, erasure, and violence enacted upon and within different worlds and in different ways, the lessons of survivance in the face of those acts of violence might nevertheless translate across disparate conditions. So the second word I'm going to give you a little bit of explanation for, and it's relevant for the discussion today, is broken. So if breakdowns have world disclosing properties, which is what our starting assumption for this issue was, following Stephen Jackson, then survival and survivance underpin particular strategies of perseverance. And so in our issue of JAE, we wanted to focus on these types of intelligences and away from the white supremacist Eurocentric narrative of progress and its codification of breakdowns. So, like all editorial projects, and this one is a peer-reviewed journal, we work with different voices that we got through different channels, trying to assemble a kind of issue that might have the capacity to, shift the discourse a little bit. One of the things I'm going to just highlight are a set of interviews that we did for the journal, that we solicited for the journal, in which Leslie Loco is the sort of representative of the discipline, but otherwise we included people like Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, Shannon Mattern, and Wayne Yang. All of these are people who have been thinking about either maintenance and repair, in some cases of pedagogy specifically, or sort of rethinking or thinking about how we rewire the academy and the university and how to sort of make what they offer work for the world. So these journals are recent, and in some ways, the impetus for them has been brewing through other modes of work. And I want to show you aspects of the Critical Broadcasting Lab work as I announced, and specifically the kind of pedagogical experiments conducted within its framework that are, in my mind, part of the larger project of preparing architectural pedagogy. The key thing about this notion that there is a framework for the Critical Broadcasting Lab and that it might impart something to pedagogy is the idea that everything we produce in these contexts, and they range from studio to seminar to workshops, has to be able to both, or has to be conceived both as a proposal, architectural proposal, but also as a broadcast, as something that is actually imagining an audience that it advocates to with a set of concerns. So key one of the experiments, and partly because we're thinking about this for the project and the exhibition, is the Collective Architecture Studio, which took place first in Belgrade in 2019, as you see. Then we went and did something in Boston in 2022 in Roxbury. And then now we are this spring again working on Belgrade as a kind of site of exploration and as a resource of archival material. For me, when I first did the 2019 project, it was I conceived of it as a one-off experiment. I'm just lucky to have been able to continue the experiment and to sort of transfer some knowledge across these moments. But in that singular experiment, I thought, I was interested in challenging a whole set of well-established and now already deeply habitual formats in academia. For example, the way that authorship works and is credited and evaluated away from the kind of single genius designer, as well as the way that, or I was interested in going to a place where dreams about architecture might be different than the ones that we are conditioned to have in our US bubble, and are different because in part the formats of and forms of ownership might have, or were different at some previous point. So, sorry, I'm gonna tell you a little more before I go to like more visually enticing kind of items. But there was a saying, and I can call it an old saying, the way that science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson did recently in his The Ministry of the Future, some of which takes place in Zurich and now makes more sense to me. But the old saying is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And this notion, which is now part of the leftist folklore, has been attributed alternatively to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. But it was also important to Mark Fisher's framing of the notion of capitalist realism. Fisher was concerned with what he says, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. So what he calls capitalist realism is precisely the naturalization of this notion that the politically mutable has become immutable. And so we are now a few years after his set of claims in 2009, and a few cataclysmic events later, and the cliche seems to have grown teeth and started biting. So I want to, before I go further, I just want to sort of give you the names of the people who constituted the Collective Architecture Studio, the first version in 2019. I won't do the same for every other if I invoke them, but what I wanted to do is give you these names in the way that we sort of thought about them, so that when you see the products of the studio, you understand them all as signed by this collective. So So let's start where we started, the studio itself, with a kind of a picture and a notion of 1989. And I was asking students, and I'm asking you now, to consider that year beyond the common capitalist realist characterization of it. So this annus mirabilis of Eastern European peoples was understood widely as the triumph of democracy. As some of you will know, Francis Fukuyama thought the events of '89, also known as the fall of the wall or the end of communism, had marked the end of history itself. Another philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, thought the historical events of '89 had finally placed Eastern Europe on the right path, back on track to becoming proper liberal democracies. And in his view, the events of '89 were a form of compensatory revolution. And he was not the only one. Of course, these are the terms of the colloquial understanding of what those events and efforts were. The kind of understanding of the historical implications of the efforts of Eastern European people to rid themselves of their oppressive regimes. But more recently, Croatian philosopher Boris Budin, who is one of the most important commentators of the transition across this geography of Eastern Europe, transition to capitalism, offered that the conception of Eastern European revolutions of '89 as revolutions in reverse infantilized the subjects of post-socialism everywhere. It also decisively and swiftly sent all of the then freed countries straight into transitions towards global capitalism without any assessment of what their socialisms had achieved or what might happen if the link between central planning and important and functioning public infrastructures was severed. So also imagining '89 to have been in the service of Eastern Europe's catching up to the West allowed the West to not to question its own historical moment and trajectory. So the studio hypothesized that by engaging in retelling the pertinent aspects of historical, by which I mean both architectural and political heritage, and by offering urban and architectural alternatives from the position that valued this socialist heritage in the context of Belgrade, the fruits of its labor would have a critical function on both sides of the former Cold War divide. And what you're seeing here is the map of the general plan of Belgrade, which was accepted in 1951. And which was in large part executed in that context. Particularly important is the kind of New Belgrade area, which was the largest new town in Europe in the post-war moment, and the capital of the federal Yugoslavia. But it also was a map that hung for a very long time in the Center for, or the Institute for Urbanism in Belgrade, and made its way to MoMA when the MoMA put up the show towards a concrete utopia. But this would be a kind of one of the items in our archive as we would consider what Belgrade had to give us and how we would engage it. So there were two registers or forms of collectives that we were interested in. The first one was the kind of architecture and the architectural heritage, architecture for the collective good and for collective ownership that is a product of that era. And second was the conception of self-managed group or perhaps common authorship that was implemented and performed through self-managed architectural enterprises. But we were interested both in sort of the products architecture that would deal with the collective ownership and the collective subject, and also ways in which we could learn from working as a collective and challenging at least the signature. In imagining that we could and should take on the archives of Yugoslavian socialism and repurpose them forward, we were joining a real movement against developer housing in the city. And at the time in the US, we were living in an unprecedented developer, or living with an unprecedented developer government. But we were joining, in a way, citizens who were protesting developments in Belgrade that followed a very different narrative than the one that they had either a direct or a cultural memory of. So apart from engaging Belgrade so as to challenge the capitalist realist limitations of our own dreaming, going there was also a way to make my own investment in the collective, both radical and nostalgic, available for the scrutiny of the collective architecture studio. And here, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to comment this. Maybe we can talk about it later. This is us looking at the completely demolished main train station, making way for Belgrade on the waterfront, which has been the kind of icon of developer urbanism, investor urbanism in that city. And the key motivator or catalyst for some of the protests and real political transformations. But as I was sort of presenting myself as partly a subject for my students to study and critique, I was taking cues from one of the most important theorists of transgressive engaged teaching, bell hooks, who 25 years ago called for experimental embodied teaching to challenge habits, teaching that self-consciously cultivates utopia. And in her description, the fact that of my own biography, or the fact that my own biography was implicated in the context was relevant. So all this so that we could eventually collectively ask, what would it mean to upend the cult of individual genius in architecture, to enable the intelligences, protocols, and values of the collective? What would it mean to sidestep the market? And how do we transform the school itself in order to begin to test answers to these questions? So we started by trying to understand, to the best of our ability, things like self-management, often presented in books, in photographs like this one of workers in a big self-managed enterprise bought of a shoe factory, moving together out of or into a factory. But we also wanted to understand what happens when what was a constitutional right to housing in one regime becomes obstacle to market forces in the other. And the little thing here reads, once workers, now homeless, and it was part of a self-made museum on the site where workers were evacuated from their housing, workers of a big construction conglomerate, Trudbenik. After studying some of these things, sort of as, again, in the cursory where before we went, we produced a series of one-to-one interventions on ourselves that we thought of as commoning devices, and they included an archive, protocols for working together, as well as these couple of things, a collective garment and a game. And we presented both of these in the gallery and architectural office collective in Belgrade. So the garment was in many ways, I mean, I can talk about all of these different things that we were trying to do, but the garment was in many ways referencing things in the context, whether those might be, or those might be things like the pioneer scarves and the red that is very sort of iconic. They're also talking about the protest and the crowd and the way in which many different people might become one. Each of the pieces was its own unique piece, but they could zip together into a collective. And for me, I don't have an image here, but for me, a really important sort of artwork that precedes this is Czech artist Milan Knižak's hat for the crowd, which is a similarly sort of, let's say, a commentary that also produces a kind of effect of a collective through experience of that hat, or in this case of the garment. The wearable self-management game recasts some of the key theoretical tenets of self-management into levels of difficulty. There were 4 levels of difficulty for this game. These sleeves are something that one wears, and so the bodies are sort of comically immobile, but also connected with this game board, I'm going to call it. There's a better way for it, but with a collective collar and a series of holes that require, the goal of the game is for balls to be placed in holes in a particular way. So the first kind of version of this game, or the least difficult one, is where everyone can see and they can communicate and talk to one another as they play it. The next level is called foreman. It includes someone who is able to guide others while others are visually impaired. There's one where everyone tries to place balls in other people's holes. And there's one where one person is visually impaired, but everyone else can see, and they have to all place balls in the visually impaired person's bag. So this is us playing a couple of levels of the game. We produced also preemptively a set of proposals for park in New Belgrade Ušće, which has been a kind of a backdrop for all kinds of ideologies over the last since really the Second World War, but in the recent years they've included some pretty outrageous proposals. And we knew that this is where the park is, and we knew that more things were coming its way, so we wanted to intervene in the kind of discussion about what could be there. But ultimately, working in Belgrade, we worked with activist groups to figure out how to think about intervening in this context with housing, which seemed to them to be the most important thing to take on, because in the context of a kind of developer government there too, the kinds of housing provisions that would have existed, certainly the housing for all was gone, but also housing that was affordable to many was gone. So we, working with the group called the Ministry of Space, who have a tool that they call Spacebook. We were looking at sites that were in limbo or still in state or city ownership that could receive different kinds of things other than the developer housing. And we also worked with the group called Pametnija zgrada, or Smarter Building, who have ideas about how to think about bottom-up, collective, cooperative sort of structuring, financial structuring of dealing with housing. And we produced a set of alternatives that we offered in what we thought were easily circulable pattern books, working with a pattern book as a kind of notion, something that you could produce and send out or sort of email out, that described both housing in architectural terms and in financial terms. And then the final event, formerly known as the review, for that event we invited our friends who, various friends to first of all resist the juridical call of that format and to join us in actually experiencing first some of these games. Be open to talking differently about the work too, that basically we're not inviting them to adjudicate what we did, but to actually talk to us about the expertise that they have in relation to projects in a much more intimate and open way, instead of having a kind of a jury that sits and judges a set of moves by a student. In many cases, students who presented the work or the way in which presentation operated with authorship was scrambled. So you rarely were talking to the person who did the work directly. And then we repeated some of those things, though in a slightly different version, for the final event of the last year's studio, which went to the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So for this one, we actually started with a set of games which were a little less physical than the ones for Belgrade. But we went to the heart of this red line district, which, if you know about redlining, you know is the historically black neighborhood in Boston. And it's a home for a very important land trust, which was initiated in the 1980s through a lot of activism locally. And basically the trust has been able to define and decide about its own land in ways that are very important for them. And that, for me, again, signal a kind of alternative that exists, but we are conditioned not to see it. It exists right there, 15 minutes from MIT, kind of collective ownership of land and collective management of land. But the games in this context also helped us interact and talk to a set of children or school children who were very near our site, on which we proposed food hubs, which is what the Dudley Street neighborhood wanted from us. And ultimately, the key things that were truly collectively produced, if you wanted to sort of say everyone touched this object, were both the final events in both of these cases, as well as this collective drawing that we sent to Tallinn Biennial. In the current studio that's happening now, I just want to draw your attention to this thing. We just had our first event of the studio in which the first outing with guests, in which we presented the first sort of set of issues or questions that we're dealing with, which are directly about the question of maintenance. We're working on the block 23 in New Belgrade, which is part of the central zone of New Belgrade that has in the last 2 years been turned into a cultural good by legally, and it's not clear yet what preservation of that would mean, but we were interested in literally maintenance and repair, and how would one sort of, in conversation with all of the kind of discourse about it, what would it mean to take maintenance and repair and fixers, or fixer as a kind of role, and move the center of the discipline over those questions, right? So that we try to imagine architecture starting there, not ending there. And so there are certain proposals for how to mark damage, how to play games about this so that everyone understands or begins to care about certain items in the housing on different scales. But there's more coming out of that. Now, one thing that we were doing at the same time as we did the first collective architecture studio was a proposal from the lab for the São Paulo Biennial in 2019, which was dedicated to the everyday. And in that, in part also inspired by that self-management game and using it for this, we started with these two images, one of children in a three-legged race running together, screaming in delight with their legs tied together. So clumsy and fun. The success of every team in this game depends on arriving at some amount of coordination and cooperation. And then the other is this image of a long spoon that can only sort of work if you are enabling others in the food. There are more important sort of, or like existential things about that long spoon, but what we wanted to do was propose to remake a table setting such that a number of elements would require cooperation in the manner of these objects. And we propose to multiply forms of direct dependence across the party, let's say, in order to foster kinship and delight, and kinship in delight, and delight in kinship. And so we sent 3 suitcases with this set of items in them that included, it's a very pre-pandemic project, that included ways of sharing across these utensils, which we took, unpacked, and with some instructions on how to play this game, installed in the context of São Paulo. These were the seats that we were interested in at the time because as inflatables, they would require also negotiation. And we had our friends in São Paulo help us launch this through eating and hopefully, having fun. It looks like they're having fun, so we accept that. And finishing in a way that opening event with the game, which we also later got some pictures of other visitors using it. So this was a way in which some aspects or pieces from the studio traveled into a curatorial kind of setting. And then during the pandemic, we got a small grant to think or develop further that seat, we thought. We called it Seesaw, and we thought it would be a set of these sort of sausages connected together that would allow us to feel each other's presence even as we were masked and distanced, and maybe even leave a drawing. This actually morphed into what we now think of as collective seesaws or wobbles, and we were able to launch them at MIT in April. And we thought that we had planned for a nice balance between safety and fun, but didn't anticipate some of this kind of uses that you see here. But they proved in a way the concept. It's a very, very simple proposition, a one-liner, but one that produced a lot of excitement at MIT. So the next thing I wanted to show you, are you okay? Am I still making sense? The next thing I wanted to show you is actually an exhibition, and in part because it will highlight another pedagogical context that in which some of these questions of how we work together and how we might best ask some questions comes up. So the Playroom was an exhibition in 2020. It closed 10 days or maybe a week before we closed down because of the pandemic. So we were lucky to be able to actually play it out, to use that word again. And some of the work in it comes from the studio. So again, our self-management or Balls for All had an appearance in this particular exhibit too. But some things came from the first history theory class that I teach called Positions. And you're seeing here the beta version of Hylanopoli during the kind of final event of the class itself. And here's another one a year later. This game was called Tort. This one didn't actually make it into the exhibition, but I just wanted to highlight it as another sort of friendly kin game that comes out of the same class, in part because the final question and task for students in this context is to produce something that is an intervention in the discipline along the lines and nature of things that they're interested in putting forward. And in this case, Tort is a game that combines buildings, sites, and laws to stop buildings fictionally in the game. So there is a series of laws around the globe that they've collected by which you can argue that a building should not be built. There's a set of buildings that they were looking at and a set of sort of typologically specific sites, not so generic in some way, typologically determined sites. And then one has to make an argument that is a kind of a legal argument for why this building should not be built in this context. The game has to have a judge to hear all of the claims and decide who wins. And more recently, just this last fall, we were playing also Cards Against Sustainability. So Playroom, when it opened, looked like this. It included a set of tables and in total 5 different games. We developed a set of tables for it in conversation with the history of tables that can move around, that in some sense have origins in the military, for better and for worse, and also the playing table, card playing table. For us, they were therefore covered in felt, and they included the games and the kind of material of the exhibit in them. We deployed them and then invited the school to play in the space of the gallery. Hylanopoli, as you can imagine, occupies the model and the logic of the Monopoly game, but it looks at gentrification around Highline in New York, with actual data for all of the costs of apartments and architecture, actual drawings for buildings, actual architects for each of them. So you can, and so these are properties that the students working on this researched, and you can have a chance card in which a critic says something, or a material is costing a lot, or a Starchitect card. Some of these cards are documentary, some of them are invented. We also developed a portion of the game in which, or the kind of new dimension to the Monopoly game, in which you can buy air rights, and you can also buy a Starchitect facade that will, of course, enlarge your earnings in the context of this game. So it is eminently playable, and it enabled discussions about the topics. All of our money has architects who are around this high line also. But what it enabled is a discussion about some of these logics of the gentrification and in general sort of contestation about what it means, or at least a discussion about what it means to engage in, well, developer urbanism. Every week during the duration of this exhibit, we dedicated to one of the games, and so we had a big play date with the school when one game was played across all of the tables, and the discussion could sort of fill up the room on these topics. The second game is Portfolio Agency. It's a game that for us brought in a topic of prep schools, mostly in China. This is something that we are very unclear on as faculty when it comes to admissions, and students are very vocal or upset or also unclear. And so the point was partly to figure out what is this prep school landscape, and to have the students specifically discuss this amongst themselves. It occupies the logic of snakes and ladders, or chutes and ladders, with a set of cards where these can be sort of understood, what your whole spectrum of possibilities can be understood as you play this game, possibilities for prepping. So we did have also, fun. Our fun was helped by other things. The next game here is called Discarded, and was occupying, again, the game that you will know, memory card game. But the point here was the idea that often we erase and whitewash aspects of architectural narratives to make architecture continue to be palatable to us. So in this case, each building, and buildings were what you were looking to find, would come with 3 cards. One was a kind of a factoid, one was a kind of a cultural celebration of the project, and the third was something, a piece of information about the human or other costs that went into this building. And as you played this game, again, playable, those were sort of conditions of each of these. You begin to relate the information to the objects or to the architectures, which would make you eventually not able to play the game anymore. But 2 other games that were included was, one was the Balls for All and an Identity Gamble. And I want to show you Identity Gamble. This game came out of a workshop that was called Agit Arc, also held by the Critical Broadcasting Lab. And it's a game that you can play anywhere, at the airport, at school. It includes everything that's in your pocket. A set of identifications, money, etc. And the point is to collect everyone's items to clear the table. You do that by finding ways to talk about identity and the way in which these objects carry certain identities. So I'll just let them say a couple of things.
MIT card. Transportation.
If you want the rules, I can give them to you, but they're very easy.
I believe.
If you make a mistake,
critic.
Mexican document.
it goes on like that. Someone actually collects everything at the end. So I could have more. I could stop here and give you a concluding sentence, or I could go a little more. What do you want? All right, so, I mean, the important thing, and maybe this is for the conversation later, is maybe to talk about the way in which some of these moves and structures or tests foster and enact collectives, and the way in which games solicit different kind of criticality or solicit criticality differently than some other modes of operating. But the key thing, maybe I'll just leave it this before I move into the next phase anyway, is that, you know, all of the research and curatorial work and pedagogical work that I conduct through or within the framework of the Critical Broadcasting Lab, and in different formats before it, carve out a space within the pedagogical space of the school, and I hope in the discipline, a space where we can take time to grapple with different types of knottedness, with architecture deeply entangled, sometimes closer to the center of the knot and sometimes dangling at its periphery. And so some of the work, the curatorial work, doesn't tend necessarily towards architectural outcomes immediately. It precisely delays them so that we can think about and narrate questions differently and summon and gather comrades around them. I have two little things. These are sort of more recent projects by Critical Broadcasting Lab. This one during the pandemic, and it was, we were interested in using the AI to think about super talls. We were interested in figuring out how to say something critical about super talls with the AI, or say something about the AI with the super talls. It didn't quite do the things we wanted, so we had to resort to a game we know, and that's Tetris. So we looked at the series of buildings in New York that are termed super talls that have been produced over the last 10 years, except for this iconic one. Or buildings that are not super tall in the terms of their height, because most of these are above 1,000 feet, but buildings that, like this one, we think operate within the logic of the super tall or the developer housing in New York that is producing those super talls, even if they come in a different form. We thought about how to sort of allow this, or how to frame the playing field for this Tetris game, and figured that Manhattan at Central Park made most sense. And you can play it if you go to our website. You can go to Tetris to play it. You will, with each descending tetramino, you will see what the building is, how much it costs to build, who the architect is, who the developer is, the contractor. You can, in this game, also change to all the facades of the game. So if you know the building, you will know how to play it better. But the house always wins. It is what makes a lot of money, so it may be a little frustrating. And then the final thing I want to invoke or bring into this room is the project that we're working on that is a collaboration with the Critical Broadcasting Lab, with the Architectural League of New York. And it's really a podcast series. I would prefer not to, in which the key question we ask architects is to tell us about the commission that they refused or that they would refuse, and on what grounds. What kinds of things would that refusal sort of draw out as a set of limitations within which they were willing to work? When can they make such decisions in their career? And whether or not these are discussed within the context of the firm and how they're discussed. And we have just launched maybe 10th episode, but these are the first 6. And if you're interested in Michael Maltzen, it just hit the podcast world. And I'm gonna stop here. All right. What's the announcement? Okay.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It was wonderful. It was really a pleasure, and somehow a little bit ironic to think that the students are currently preparing their reviews for tomorrow, and are engaged in a completely different sort of architectural pedagogy, which you know, forces them to be in a very kind of a productive mindset right now. But it's a moment to.
Our mindset is productive.
It's also productive, of course, but in a different. So we can precisely talk about the kind of productive and the productivist, and maybe the difference between those. But I now would like to invite our guests, and so today with us, Nazli, I kindly ask you to take the microphones to the audience. So we have Freek Persyn, my colleague. I'm talking to people on Zoom. I think we have around another 30 people in the online auditorium. In case anybody is not from our department, Freek is a professor of urban design at the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies. Also, I think person who has been interested in working on, for instance, the kind of horizontal studio model, interested in working sort of beyond the hierarchy in teaching context. Grégoire Farquet, who is in fact doing his PhD on learning spaces and was co-editing a recent journal on learning spaces with ArcPlus. And then we have a fantastic group, Unmasking Space, a student-led initiative at our department, working on novel pedagogies and actually proposing a student-led course that precisely is concerned with, let's say, pedagogical innovation, if I may say so. And then we have with us also my co-curators, and especially welcome Marjanović, who is a little bit ours still at ETH, did her PhD at GTA a few years ago, and also concerned with these questions of, as Anna was mentioning, developers urbanism, and I would return to that notion of architectural imaginaries in this context. Maria is also curating a Luxembourg pavilion at the upcoming Venice Biennale. And then finally, Nazli, thank you, our postdoc and also expert on critical walking, among other things. So I will actually join you. And
You're just going to hold it like that. Maybe that's.
Would you like would you like to start? Yes, great.
Anna, thank you so much for presenting this absolutely fantastic and inspiring work. I was taking notes all the time as you were talking, very inspiring. I would like to ask you, so maybe to explain in briefly, for instance, how does architecture, collaborative architecture studio runs in terms of also the kind of hierarchy between the student and the teacher, and maybe also kind of a speculative question. What would happen in 3 decades when once kind of collective architecture studio spills over the school, and how would collective architecture school look like, let's say?
Well, first, in terms of sort of the way that it operates, you know, like the idea is partly that we try out different formats for the collective, and that the collective rearranges itself. I offer a few ways that everyone can think about it, but ultimately, the production actually does affect the way in which the collective organizes, right? So there are certain ways, and what becomes clear to everyone involved is that we do have to think about skill sets, labor, and organizing in a way that's useful. Some of that, we spent a lot of time last year thinking about how horizontal collectives work. Is that the right way to do it? How do we make decisions? And I personally always find that actually when decisions can come after work, it's much better than when decisions come before work, which is also hard. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of time that we would spend on verbalizing a decision, which is made a lot easier if there are actually things already kind of artifacts already participating in that decision-making process. For us, the key thing that I think is important about this is that we are challenging the review format with this first and foremost. So ultimately, there are certain hierarchies depending on different questions and different sort of questions that or tasks that we are taking on. But when we are facing outsiders, people who are not part of the collective, but are our friends, then the fact that you cannot easily peg who is who and that we are insisting on a collective signature is very important, because it takes away the kinds of anxieties of the review format. It takes away the kinds of psychologizing of the student that often happens in that format. And it also enables the experts to talk about the work in a different way when they get used to the flow of that. For me, I do think there's already a few of these in the landscape of the US, and we are, discussing this and talking, and so spreading some of the knowledge or the lessons from running these studios. I do think that what's at the end of it, let's say, is a vision of a school in which I think in order to truly rewire the discipline, we have to, I think we as faculty have to accept that there are certain things that our students have better or at least equal understanding of and capacity to work with. And that even if we have certain wisdoms that I think will be, irrelevant, that we have to be co-learning. And so figuring out how to do that, I think, is part of the task of, repairing pedagogy.
Maybe just a very banal question. Is there a collective grade as well?
Yes. So we discussed, the first time we discussed this, it was funny. With drinks, we sat down and I was like, okay, we have to talk about how we're going to produce this grade. Would you like to grade each other? Would you like me to grade you individually? Would you like me to grade you collectively? Would you like to grade ourselves collectively with a single grade? And the single grade is what they proposed for the whole studio.
Fantastic.
Which was actually an issue to defend at the next level of in the structure.
I wanted to ask you before we maybe share the mic and sort of really involve the guests who are in fact experts on the topic, but my curiosity as you were talking is I thought about the kind of function of this game as a kind of aesthetics, as a kind of politics, as a kind of tool of negotiation, not only with the students, but also with the faculty or with the institution, or as MIT as an institution, and does the game, in your opinion, retain the right amount of criticality that you want to have, or does it help, perform, let's say, repair in institutional context? How do you see it?
Well, there are different things that I showed. I've called them all games, but they have slightly different sort of ways of performing in the context of the studio and the school. And I do think the few that had a kind of a physical interaction that required, our guests to take the risk of kind of participating in it with us, are really about simulating something and actually having us collectively experience something that then produces a kind of bond that allows for a different kind of conversation. It's a little bit different than the games in which we were specific about the kinds of narratives and goals that we were, of kind of data that we were trying to actually transmit and invite a different kind of more sort of discursive conversation on. I think the games that were in response to Belgrade and self-management, I find as simultaneously ironic and critical of aspects of self-management, or of, you know, pioneer uniforms, or of socialism in some sense. But I also found them performing that sort of collectivizing as a performance. So they had both ends kind of built into them in a way that, for me, I could recognize, right? I could recognize that there was some laughter about, like they were not taking seriously the logic of it, even though they fully understood it, and you could sort of read it out of the objects.
Is there a moment, I'm curious, in the, like as the studio unfolds, is there a moment where you go from the kind of research mode, a kind of discursive mode, into the game mode, right? How does that?
In this studio that's just happening, we have been working on repairing the Block 23, and we're working specifically with the historian Jelica Jovanović, who is employed by, in some cases, by the Institute for Preservation, that was instrumental in preserving these modernist blocks. So the students had to rapidly learn about the history of this context, the architecture of this context, the prefab methods of this context, the Belgrade on the Water as a kind of backdrop against which some of this history now makes a different kind of narrative, and produce something that are a set of proposals for how we could think about maintenance in this context. And what is an architect's role when you ask the maintenance questions. And now we have 2 weeks to produce interventions on ourselves. And that we are doing, that's sort of the moment where we could say that that's the moment where we're playing, but I don't know if they're gonna, you know, like, we'll see if it's fun or not. I'm always thinking it's fun, but in this context, we are now looking at the way in which art in the context intersected historically with the question of self-management. So this would involve Richter and a few sort of 50s and 60s artists who were thinking about how to sort of speak to aesthetically and processually to the question of self-management. And then also what they call the new art practices post-68 in that context. Again, this is people like performance art like Marina Abramović, but also a series of groups like Ojo and Tok that were all trying to have art move out into the street and do things. And so even though we are going to produce instruments or interventions on ourselves or protocols for ourselves, we are still in conversation with the historical archive of work produced in the socialist era.
And you will perform it in the public space in Belgrade, in Belgrade.
We're going to go to where Collective is now, which is a different address, but same people.
Great. Can I invite? Shall we start with unmasking space? Does it make sense? I'll pass the mic. Yeah.
So, I mean, should we introduce ourselves, what we are doing, or? Okay, so, yeah, Unmasking Space is this student-led Wahlfach, which is a collaboration between students, and like 5 of us, we prepared this Wahlfach and made an open call for students to contribute any topics they feel are like underrepresented in the current curriculum, or just topics that they want to share with others. And now in this semester we were having this Wahlfach, yeah, between students.
So it's like kind of meant to be like a platform Thanks. There's a platform that is established by students and for students. That's what we always say with ourselves. And the thing is, like, because it was really interesting as like kind of a like an event for like a curator, like we curate a set of lectures and series, but also how then these workshops would then interact and kind of involve with like a different kind of learning, because we always say that, oh, this is going to be like a parallel pedagogy for something that already exists. And then there was a really, really interesting moment when you just said it about like the grading, because it always comes back into, if we do something in the department and it's actually revolving around pedagogy, how do we grade? And we had this a long discussion actually within ourselves, but also with with Vera, actually, like the department, the person who's in charge also of kind of changing the pedagogy because of the curriculum reform. And then she was saying that, and in the end we resorted to pass and fail, and also self-grade, but plus mutual grade. Because, and then we had this idea from Vera who was saying that if a student can actually not grade themselves, or the grading of themselves were actually very far away from the grading of the actual grades of the faculty, it's actually a kind of a failure of pedagogy, because like, for example, like some people be like, but my studio is not good, and then in the end they get a 6 or they get like a 4 mark or something, and it's kind of like, and I think it's also then it makes much more sense, because nobody actually, I think in a collective setting like this, claims to be an expert on certain things, although some would have a different skill set as others, then to establish this.
Do you have a question?
So my question
or do you want me to comment on that in general?
But it's actually okay. So I have one. No, but I have one question, which is actually asking also for myself, which is like, when we say something is repairing an institution, we kind of have an inherent meaning of the institution is broken, or the pedagogy is broken. And in a certain sense, why would you, or like, why would you choose the word repair, and how do you like kind of?
This is why I think the Jackson definition, or the way that he talks about fixers, is for me important. It's like, actually repair is happening all the time, right? It's like, in order to maintain something, we are constantly doing it. The idea that something is completely broken is a slightly different proposition. It comes from an idea that something was whole at any point in time, and that requires a particular position or view of the situation. I do think that there are many things in the discipline that require tending, and certainly in architecture schools, and that comes from two, at least, we could unfold various narratives, but for me, the one of habit is an important one. We have now calcified certain sort of formats and logics into the way in which schools operate across the board, and it's very hard to transform that and to adjust it to the kinds of urgencies that we recognize now collectively are there. This is not to say that those urgencies were not always there, that that in a way maybe was always broken, right? That again in a different way, but also for me, understanding the way in which architectural pedagogy and discipline are implicated in larger, really problematic narratives suggests that we have to figure out what to keep, what to rewire, what to rename, how to sort of recompose the body of the academy in a way that it serves the world we recognize we are in collectively. Even though, as I said, I think there are many worlds in this world and many points of view on it, and many forms of brokenness and repression, etc., and violence. But learning from, so what we were proposing in the JE issue is that learning from that sort of surviving, constantly having to sort of operate in the mode where your survival is in question, is relevant, that's where some of the most important knowledges are. And that actually you will find in many places if you're able to see differently. I don't know if that makes sense. But that's different than the grade thing. I can talk about
I'm curious if you want to say which topics have you identified as the kind of absent from the curriculum, or that you put priorities on.
I don't know if it goes under topics, but also when you were talking about the games, I found it very interesting because I think for me, like the most important, or one of the most important things about Unmasking Space is probably that it's really like this student-only space. And when you were talking about these games and like everybody taking, like being part of the game, kind of like changing also the roles of people. And I think like this was, for me at least, it was like one of the key things, like suddenly you are a student, but also kind of a collaborator in this whole project, and you're not taking a course from a professor. And I think this makes like a huge difference on your engagement and how you actually, learn also. So for me, this was like this kind of meta ebene was like one of the important things.
Thanks. I wanted to go back to this idea of co-authorship, to this text which you shared with us, and you start that with the introduction of what you mean by we, and this really stuck to me because you say it's you, like we with Anna and Ann, you're the co-author. And then it's us, the readers, so it's in that sense inclusive, and then it's all the other contributors. So this was making me think. Then I was thinking this Ayn Rand book I read in high school, Anthem, where she uses pejoratively we as a pronoun, and then the hero discovers the pronoun I. That's the story. And then I was also thinking about this revelation I had while doing research that, you can also use we in an article, like because we are used to so much this passive voice, and this is also the title, you say, like the career back theory of co-authoring. It's the gerund form, it's not authorship, co-authorship. And you're saying to be in that maybe cumulative, collaborative we, you need to be at home, being in slippery grounds, always negotiating, mediating, being used to things being changing, and I think you say like walking on wet sands, right? And this, then I just want to make a reference to Unmasking Space. We recently co-organized this workshop together last week in Parity Talks. It's also about action. That was the main theme. And all these student-led initiatives came from all around Europe to Zurich to do this. And I think there was a really interesting spirit. And I think you will kind of, Kiana is also there behind the camera, but she's also part of Unmasking Space and our team. I felt like there will be much more going on after, but we were also discussing these things, how then kind of this spirit is dispirited, you're disenchanted. Because I also heard in some other events, their course was really questioned in the sense that what will you as students teach to us, the people who know things. So then it always comes to kind of like there is always this backlash, and then when you go into teaching or research or practice, and then you're facing these obligations of daily life or these institutions, the way that things are always done, then you're squared out, and maybe you just settle in. So I was wondering, you say that this view of yours is kind of in a way hopeful, and you are like at home in this walking in the wet sand, but I'm wondering, how do you keep up that hope? I mean, is it the thrill, or I mean, because
I have pills for it? No, I'm kidding. No. There are a few answers I want to make. One is the key one about the co-authoring argument is that I think if we start to think we in various situations, when we're in the conversation with the context, when we're in the conversation with the developer, with the material circumstances, with others that are working with us side by side. That mindset, the one in which I am not producing it, but we are, already, I think, is transformative. It basically changes the way we might relate and try to find ways of collaborating, even non-conceptually, right? Like we, even if others are not agreeing that they are part of the we, is really transformative in thinking about how we produce effects as architects, or as teachers, or as students. But on the other hand, I think this is like simply there is no choice. It's either we all are going to, this is a very socialist proposition, either it gets better for all of us or it doesn't. There is no we. It's just like a way of operating in this, in the singular I, is a dead end, I think, for all of us. So, and maybe that in a couple of different ways comes from, again, from my particular sort of heritage. One, I'm imbued, I've been baptized in the we. And so I recognize that now. I didn't fully understand it before, but now I'm old enough. I'm like, okay, I understand. This actually happened to me. On the other hand, when you come from a context where shit is broken all the time, you have to have hope. That's like the most important thing to kind of hold on to, the hope that you can transform it and that you can transform it collectively. So
I really relate to that.
Do you want to take this up, Freek? You have a very particular approach to hierarchy or non-hierarchy in your studio. How does it work in your case?
Start by checking if this microphone works.
Oh, it's red.
I don't think so. Test it.
Yeah.
Okay, now it should be green. Now it should work. No, I can relate to a lot of things that you show, and I can also, I think, recognize a lot of confusions that easily arise when in the school, when you want to put these topics on the table. And I was wondering if these confusions also surface now, so maybe that's something we could verify. So one thing I recognize is this search to be whole, but I relate it to be whole, yeah. I relate this very much to kind of personal desire that we all have. So the brokenness, I think I can relate it very much to this desire to be fully into something and to dedicate yourself fully and to, let's say, link to others. And so this desire to link to others is, I think, a drive that fosters a lot of this work. But I see potentially confusion with the collective. And there was, for instance, last semester, the self-organized studio, where students wanted to step out of the model of, let's say, relating to the professor, performing a task. So all out of this desire to be fully driving themselves. But this was very quickly coupled to the fact that they then suddenly thought that they had to decide everything together and that every decision had to serve everyone. And so there's a lot of illiteracy in how to do this together and why you would want to do it together. And so there's a lot of, let's say, yeah, there's a lot of things to be learned, especially also in a school which is indeed still organized like a church, or like you have indeed one president, which manages in some way 30,000 people, to this idea of distributed authority, which I think this is aiming for. I think this is a very interesting tension, and I'm wondering how you deal, especially
my pedagogical aim is to arrive at certain kinds of literacies, right? So in fact, we have to sometimes try something, waste time sometimes trying it, but we have to learn the lessons that actually can only come out of that kind of embodied knowledge. For me, I'm not sure wholeness is a thing. I do think that certain kind of what goes with, in at least the studios that I teach and the kind of, in general, the pedagogical formats and projects that I deliver, I do think the kind of understanding that we're all complex people is relevant. That's a very sort of bell hooks version again, that actually we all bring our own baggage to the table, and that knowing that baggage and appreciating that baggage for what it can give us is actually going to enrich that experience. That I agree, and maybe that's a kind of whole. But for me, you know, part of co-authoring and the question of broken in a variety of different ways is that that's the reality. We are also all broken, and so we have to figure out how to collaborate in those conditions, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that everything is, you know, like we have to learn that actually not everyone can speak at the same time. Actually, not every idea is equally good. And we have to figure out how to sort of operate given that set of, I don't know, findings. But those have to be also palpable, right? Like, it's useful to run into a set of failures and be like, oh, that really didn't work. We don't like what we made.
No, but what I wanted to refer to was the images of collectives that you show are also very much related to images of central planning, which I think historically, to a certain extent, the huge, let's say, shame or pity of the collapse of socialism is the fact that this were often countries which were centrally planned, and that capitalist countries were often allowing a certain distributed authority. That somehow the central planning killed the idea of the solidarity, or central planning killed the desire of the togetherness. So I think this kind of the collapse of these two things is something interesting to untangle, I think. But I see that what I'm saying, that I make you.
I'm not sure. I'm wondering if I should take this one, how to take it. Is it my battle? I mean, I do think, you know, there's no question that there were certain things that were centrally planned in the context of Yugoslavia, but there was also the way in which self-management was supposed to work. The idea was a kind of ultimate dissolution of the state and central planning. And so I don't know what that would have looked like. We didn't, you know, arrive there. But it's also true that institutions that were there for the sake of central planning, like the Institute for Urbanism, are now completely part of a kind of the developer market-driven kind of process, and that the citizenry is missing their former role, their former ability to actually, let's say, defend the collective interest. So I don't know. I don't know that I can make bigger statements on like social.
In a way, I can perhaps try to step in because you know, I think you were very clear in the beginning with this sort of interpretation what 1989 meant, right? From this kind of end of history to the, you know, a victory, final victory of the, I don't know, liberal capitalism as the kind of the true and the right model, and so on, to that reading by Boris Budin as a kind of revolution in reverse, which is essentially a counter-revolution. Yeah. And I think, especially in a country which is Yugoslavia, which was this very specific model of you know, socialist modernization, which was not having the same kind of collectivism as the Soviet countries, right? So there was the self-management was specifically the effort by the state to decentralize authority, right? So that was not the failure of the central planning. That was a failure of you know, I think pressures from the outside, pressures of, balancing the private and the collective, balancing the let's say the individual and the collective, learning democracy, learning what it means to manage oneself, right? And I think it was like Anna, I was in a way born in that country, and I can relate because I had to step out of that system and then live in the West for 10 or 20 years to understand that I was born in something which was exceptionally unique, That I had to really learn it from the outside because it was just, I thought, this is the world, this is how things are everywhere, right? And then I went outside, I thought, it was a little bit different. And then, I had to sort of almost peel it like a fruit, right? To really kind of come to the core, right? So I think that this idea of understanding the collective in relation to the common good, to the idea of the common good, what in a society, like perhaps Swiss, I think it's. We have interesting histories in this country of cooperativism, of commoning, there is the notion of Allmende. These are structures that have been dismantled, to a high degree, like those structures that people tried to build in the socialist Yugoslavia. There is also research which is very valid and also quantitative, which shows that throughout the 20th century in various countries, Momoyo was also showing last time, the proportion of, you have basically different property ownership models, private, public, to be very kind of categorical about it, and then there is something in between. People can decide that they manage together something, right? So this is, let's say, common or cooperative. And, researchers have shown in a sort of, through a sort of GIS and other kind of real estate and analysis and so on, that throughout the 20th century, you have increase of first the state-owned or the kind of public ownership or the state ownership at the expense of the common, followed by the increase of the private property at the expense of the state property. So we are now in this kind of let me call it a kind of upside down pyramid where we have a lot of private, a little bit of public, and then a tiny, tiny bit of the common. And, 100 years ago, it was exactly upside down, right? Across all realms of, socioeconomic activity, relationships to the land, to nature, et cetera, I think that the question at the core here is, is it worth recapturing, some of those knowledges because it is also about knowledge and it is about practice. It is about people being able to manage, to have a responsibility, to have a relationship to the idea of the common, right? So it's not a kind of in that sense, I see it as a very concrete project, right? But and I see it also as very valuable. So I try to read your work through my lens, let's say, of my own work. I wonder, does it make sense?
Oh yeah, and in Yugoslavia, unlike others, it's very easy to sort of block it all together, and I have done that myself, even in this talk probably. The Second World is a big mass, but the kind of socially owned lands, socially owned apartments are different than state-owned ones. And there's more to that, but for me, it is, these studios in which we go to the places where alternative to capitalism exists or has existed recently enough that the memory of it exists as an alternative, have been important in precisely sort of wiring that kind of possibility of thinking that into young architects, so that when we go from Belgrade to Seaport in Boston, they start to see the developer urbanism at work, in developer architecture at work, right? And there, this is the norm. There is no citizenry to rise up against it. In Belgrade, there's still a kind of memory of like, wait, why aren't you taking care of us? So for me, those are the most important kinds of pedagogical, they're hard to quantify, they're hard to put into an object, but that is the thing that I think students walk away with, a kind of ability to take these pieces of the archive in order to see the dreams. Yeah.
Where for me also it becomes super relevant. It's somehow, I mean, this project of reparative practice in the end doesn't end up with kind of object design, right, that we are really used to in architecture school, but rather a kind of, not design, but rethinking of what community is in a way, like we kind of move from object to subject, to kind of collective subjectivity. I think this is also, I mean, the kind of the relationship that Milica is making with self-management goes somehow beyond the metaphor. It becomes almost kind of part of your historical specificity as a teacher, in a way that you also bring, in a way, your position, political position somehow to this. I think this is really interesting. I mean, when you show the picture of Balls for All, which is a kind of very, memorable game, usually, we kind of end up studios with models, right? So kind of projection of an object. Here, it's a kind of...
Some models too. I mean,
I have nothing against models. I'm just speaking about this kind of extended, let's say, view. And here, this is rather a kind of a protocol, of how to kind of think together that never has, kind of final statement in itself. I think this is also kind of, let's say, interesting part of this. One thing that comes to my mind, it's also, I mean, it's not a concrete question, it's more of a thought. When we talk about repair, for example, there is always this discussion that repair is not shouldn't be returned to the previous, right? Should kind of, be a return to the future in a way, to something that doesn't yet exist, to kind of accept the vulnerability, the injury, right? But kind of, and work with it in a certain way. And when we look into architectural education and architectural profession more broadly, there is no return to the previous condition. This previous condition is always there. I mean, profession has always been somehow part of the capitalist economy, right? I'm wondering, when we talk about repairing...
It was part of the socialist.
Yeah, when we talk about repairing, right? So which kind of future, which kind of condition, in a way, we work with, right? I mean, whether it's the past one or future one, I mean, it's a question for all, not just,
think of it, I don't know if this was, maybe it was somewhere in some article, but I didn't necessarily bring it up today forcefully. I think of this a little bit like a retro-utopian alternative for the future, right? So all of those words together. And the retro-utopian word is something that Budin uses this word from, it comes from Inge Arns, curator of some of the early sort of, particularly an expert on Yugoslavian art. But when Budin talks about it, he basically says, now in this context in which most of the things that we look at from Yugoslavia and the Eastern European model more generally are utopian, old utopia, and they are retro. We put them in to museums. We discuss them in terms of a kind of cultural memory. But they are these sort of artifacts and products that are returning back to look at this and with some amount of nostalgia. Maybe if we put them forward, he suggests what we are doing is not only talking about those objects, but also about our own distance between those objects or the utopian ideals that those objects contain and where we are, and therefore also about the futures we can imagine. So there's a kind of, in that retro-utopian alternative for the future, there's a whole set of moves that are really important that talk about how we're measuring the distance from where we stand to utopia and also to where we're looking at. So it's actually all of those views are, I think, somehow simultaneously present. And for me, the importance of looking back is because actually it is capable of holding, in some cases, when the archive contains this, is able to hold the kind of alternative to that, or a challenge to the capitalist realist kind of model, the idea that the political is not changeable, or that architecture's relationship to the political is not changeable when we're talking about architecture. So for me, that's why both views are simultaneously held is really important.
Can I ask a question in relation to that quickly? And in that sense, if you look at your the studio and the experience and the way how people are confronted with something and it creates a seed or nurtures something, how do you have, like one challenge I'm confronted with, or I feel myself confronted with, is how to, like if you do this module, which is meant to be one of the modules in the 5 years, but you also start something which has a very long line into the future, and which, how would you nurture, do you have strategies or ways or approaches of nurturing that long engagement and building up this culture, and how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like now this set of studios and questions has existed for a bit at MIT, and there's a certain amount of kind of cultural memory of what goes on. I have this year a returning student from last year's studio, which is also kind of cool. But I do think it intersects, it's like something where I don't have enough ability to, enough agency to affect what you're, I think, describing. So I think of this as I have these students in this moment, we seed and the flowers grow or they don't grow. And I hope they grow.
Maybe related to that, the flowers grow. It's maybe also related to how we teach architectural students also, and how they then enter the real world. And there was this discussion about the socio-political and economical world, because, of course, and you said, to rewire the academy or the institution so that we make people able to do something that is good for society, but also we should have some, I see some danger in having a certain island of ideals, and that is not related or disconnected to certain expectation of the society. So in the sense that a certain society or capitalist society is maybe for some decades will still exist with its power and its. I don't see. I don't know. I don't know. I don't see it dismantled so much and so that we can have an impact. So in the sense.
What I like. So I don't know if this. Sorry if I'm interrupting. But what I like about what's going on in Belgrade right now, and this was really what made me want to, for the first time, take my students to meet my parents. Right, like in some strange. Was that I think what's happening now is that the kind of generation of activists at work, for whom the memories that I might still have, but they might not, are cultural memories, they're managing to produce something bottom up that was before delivered top down. And I think that logic and that sort of thing that they're figuring out, because they have the memory and the archive, right? But they're doing it now in the context of rampant, ridiculous kind of neoliberal moment there. So it's cartoonish, the way that it is that I think what they're figuring out how to do is transferable to other places. And this way we go back to the kind of survivance question that sometimes in different contexts, these lessons will be valuable and transferable to other contexts, I think. And so we may yet be ahead of the curve in the Balkans. We may.
No, I hope, and that is really the wish that there is.
But that would be my, like, you know, I do think that this is basically a kind of an idea about trying to figure out how to, within the context of now capitalism and of private ownership and of, you know, developer architecture, they figure out ways to produce worlds that are contained and yet effective at transforming corners of that environment.
I think in relation to this, I would very much agree to what you have said, because I felt like, although I carry my own my own baggage of whatever central central planning and government is, but I felt like the survivalist knowledge that you have mentioned, I think it's like for us all, I don't know if this is right, but I would also kind of like frame it into the framework of like situated knowledge, because it's like actually this is actually, because by taking up actually the void of the institution, we found out that, what we get is actually situated knowledge. And then it's like a method of making these knowledges and also unpacking these knowledges are then the way that we can learn from. But, and I go back to the question. So I have a burning question, which is like, actually in the studios that also you have organized, like from Belgrade to Boston, and it relates back to the central planning. So it's like within a self-management group or self-organized group, what are the elements or what are the things that you would like navigate in terms of, because how do you ensure, for example, an outcome that is like into the game, or do you not ensure that? And which degree of a self-management is self-managing, because when is it verbalized and when is actually somebody taken up like kind of an organizational position? And the third one is like, then if we go back to see that this is a culmination of knowledge and also discussions and also protocols that are the slingshot bag, and we present this package to you like as a carrying bag, then how do we then unpack this result?
As who is the we?
Okay, I'll make it really specific. The people who are not in the studio and viewing a result of the studio, how do they unpack? Then unpack it as a game, or then unpack it as a total whole, or how do we deal with this complexity?
I mean, I don't know how the outside of the group unpacks what we have done. The kind of experience of it is really important. So, I mean, we can discuss it in these ways, right? To try to unpack it. But let me think what a few things that you said and see where I can intervene in the paragraph. There is a question of how the group organizes itself ultimately, and I do participate in that, and there are rebellions and there are outcomes that happen. In the first studio, at the very end, for the final event, the last 2 hours before it, they finished a diagram of who worked with whom throughout the semester and how, and they had me in one spot and then I wasn't there, and I was like, that's so sad. Didn't I work with you this whole time? Why am I not part of this diagram? Which is, telling maybe of various things, but there was an attempt to represent that for the world to see, and it made me sad as a drawing. Also, there was a moment where in that same studio, when we came back from Belgrade, I had asked everyone to organize in groups of 2 and start to think about the sites and how they would like to propose, so that we collectively have 5 proposals. And they said, there was a day went by, I came back in, and they're like, we refuse to work in 2s. We have spent our time making a manifesto of how we work together, why we work together. We have produced our standards for the graphic output of the studio. We have done this and that. And I was so happy that they had done that, right? But I was like, but look, now let's talk again about working in 2s. The task you have at hand may require you to maybe most efficient done in 2s. So why don't you figure out that part? How do you sort of accomplish this amount of work in this amount of time on these topics? And then, with the manifesto, and then figure out what we do. Again, I'm not sure that that even has to be unpacked by anyone or understood by anyone outside of that experience. But for us, these were literacies of sorts that were not imposed by me, but came out of having to work through what it means to work together on a set of questions.
Great. So we are at the very last round. I'm turning to the audience. Would you like to join the discussion? I can bring the mic. Okay. Great. Anna Maria will join. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I had a curiosity question because you have shown a lot of collective design, but I wonder the collective production. Is this also a question which materials they use? Is it repair materials? Because all the games looked very new and 3D printed. So is there also a reflection behind this aspect around the collective effort of building actually the design element? Yeah.
So let me rephrase it. Let's see if this is what you mean. Are you asking me how we make things?
Yeah.
Ultimately, exactly. I'm simplifying it, sorry. Yeah. So the studio is kind of operating as a studio, right? So it's making its own stuff. So the games are sewn in the studio by people who know how to sew and choose, like that's the kind of, the games that you saw in the exhibit were actually produced by the Critical Broadcasting Lab. So each of those games is something that originated in a different pedagogical format, and then in conversation with the authors who seeded it, we produce the next level of a kind of finish on those games so that they can have a life. So with the particular playroom thing, we were hoping at the very least for those games to travel. And then, we got discombobulated with the pandemic, and they are still sitting in my office, all of them, all of the tables, everything.
Did you bring them?
I would love to, but and with some of that, with the Hylonopoly, we actually wanted to figure out how to make enough copies that we could, at the cost that we could afford, that we could then send them out unsolicited to people that we wanted to, poke, maybe. Like there's certain of these games that have messages that we thought in the pandemic, at least, maybe this just has to be a at-home exhibition, and you just get a game, and that we understand as a kind of broadcast.
Great. So it's just fantastic how time flies in this context. So I am always really astonished, but it's past 6 already, believe me. But I have to ask one more and the very last question. That's my privilege. So it goes like this. We are. It's fascinating that we spoke about, capitalism, socialism, utopia, realities, etc., etc. It's interesting. We wanted to talk about pedagogies. Of course, it's linked, but I think it would take us another 3 hours to make properly the link. So I think everybody has a homework now to do. Just intellectually to process how the link actually performs. But I want to ask you to comment a little bit on that and just to tell us, because we are here at ETH in the process of reforming the bachelor curriculum. And there has been also a huge effort. There was a huge sort of consultation process across the student body, the faculty, to collect all the aspirations and really to try to synthesize now into something new. I think all of that has been very positive, but I'm also not sure when ultimately we have to translate this toward the kind of institutional regulation, to what extent will we succeed, also, rewriting the courses, bringing in the themes that we want to have, and so on. And I simply want to ask you to tell us, where are you at MIT with the curriculum reform, and where do you see the topics that you are working on? Co-authorship, a sort of a certain horizontality in the studio, the different formats of examination, whether they are called like that at all or not, the vision of the collective as something that supersedes the kind of vision of individualism that was probably at the kind of core ethos of a school like MIT, right? In terms of how architecture is conceptualized. Where do you see? Where are you? Where do you think the school is? So not you individually, but like reflecting on your faculty right now. It will help us, I think.
Are you recording?
We can cut it afterwards. You can still approve.
No, and so I do think, I always think that we need more conversations on the level of the collective pedagogical project. And this has been, for me, the question at MIT, but also across the board, across the schools in the US, where I feel like a collective understanding of the project has left us a little bit and or left the room or the table or whatever in favor of some things that we have made now habitual or organizational structure, and we can just plug in and deliver those pieces, right? What is demanded now is a much more holistic kind of transformation, and I think it has to come from, again, conversations that take time and effort and dedication, right? So that's not in great supply anywhere, I don't think. What we did at MIT just before the pandemic and before the George Floyd moment, which I think has truly kind of had an important inertia and a push for American schools, at least, is that we organized one day that might sound a little bit like some of the things you're trying to do here, but not one day. We organized a semester or even a whole year in order to celebrate the 150th birthday of the school. It's the oldest architecture school in the US. And for that, we introduced something that we called pedagogical experiments that were valued a little bit differently. The students could, than normal classes, students could propose classes, as could faculty, that were not fitting the normal sort of format of delivery, and it could operate across multiple long weekends or every week during the semester, but would add up to a kind of diet of credits that students would take. We could also take the classes, right? So in that sense, it was, I think, a very important moment in a sense that we could change the things that feel set, right? We haven't done that again in a while, but there's still the cultural memory in the faculty at least. But in terms of kind of thinking about curricula, there are a few things that, I think I am hearing from my colleagues that everyone is actually individually transforming their curricula to be more adaptable and to be more open to the kind of student input, and certainly to take on the burning questions of the moment. That means that some of that transformation of the curriculum is at the expense of the ways in which we thought about precedents, or we thought about what one must know in order to uphold the kind of the discipline as it was as it has been transmitted to us, right? But then there is a kind of dimension of it that I find harder to take, which has been about a kind of really quantitative evaluation of our syllabi by students. And this just gives me absolute sort of anxiety, and just even that it's an idea that we would do that. I understand that maybe we will find out some things that we don't see from where we sit. But for me, I would much rather have conversations about how pedagogies are made in the first place, how they serve, why I must have you read Patrick Schumacher, because you must understand what he's saying so that we can say something back. I mean, so for me, but then, you know, if he's going to be just valued as a particular kind of demographic on my syllabus, then that's a real problem, right? So I'm no longer teaching him, but you know, I mean, and I never taught him. So those different efforts are happening simultaneously. And if we could all play more and talk more, I think the efforts would arrive to solutions, good solutions, faster. But you know, but I'm now just delivering my stuff. So.
What got like struck with me is maybe in another text, Non-Habits, is you were saying that in Belgrade people dream differently. And I was wondering, kind of a question on pedagogy, do you think it's possible to teach or to learn to dream differently, like to have that radical imagination?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, right. If the answer is no to that, what are we doing? Isn't that the whole point of this project of education? Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. We have some drinks here for everybody who is in the honor. Special prize. Let's stay together for a extended conversation on on a new pedagogical dream that we are part of. I wish you all a good evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.